Hello and welcome to Future Now, a collaboration between AdNews and Facebook. My name is Assia Benmedjdoub. I'm the publisher of AdNews and your host for this exciting new series. So, what can you expect? In the coming weeks and months, we're going to reveal how brands and marketers have navigated 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to deep dive into different industries, bringing you insights, tools, and strategies to power through the year ahead. We thought we'd start with a macro world view, looking at how people and the economy have changed this year. And joining me is an incredible expert panel who are about to introduce themselves. Helen, I might start with you.
Hello everyone, I'm Helen Black and I head up connection and planning at Facebook Australia and New Zealand. And I spent a lot of time helping partners navigate changing consumer behaviour and understanding how to harness that to build better connections between their brands and those people. And look, I've worked in the industry for more than 15 years now, a lot of that in media agencies, heading up their strategic functions. And dare I say it, this is probably the most strategically exciting time of all of that.
Fantastic. Jenny?
Hi everyone, Jenny Child. I'm a partner at McKinsey and Company and I lead our consumer retail practice. So I spend all my time helping clients, helping Australian businesses navigate tough times, and this being one of them. So excited to be with you today.
And we'll finish up with Bree.
It's good to be with you. My name is Bree Williams and I'm the founder of behavioural science agency People Patterns. And I spend my time trying to answer the question, why won't people do what you want them to?
Well, guys, I might start with a simple question. What's the most interesting change that you've seen in 2020 and what's here to stay?
For me, it's that we've seen this mass digital education of the Australian public. So many new people embracing all sorts of new digital behaviours. When you think of something like online shopping, penetration of that has grown by more than 10 percentage points amongst older people, amongst those living outside major cities, amongst lower income earners. So it's just truly become universal. And the way that we're connecting has just expanded so much too. On our platforms, we've seen voice and video calling double in some of the countries hardest hit. And here in Australia, Instagram live views doubled in just a week back in March. But I think sometimes you can get lost in those stats, you know, and I think about my parents. They're both 80, turned 80 through lockdown, and in the last few months they have shopped online for the first time. They've switched from a newspaper to an online subscription. They're even video calling my kids, and they've even learned how to use the filters on a Facebook portal to entertain my kids. So it's both incredible and also, to be honest, rather disconcerting to see your dad virtually dressed as the big bad wolf. And, you know, people have embraced all of this. They've learned so much. And if what I think they say, Bree, maybe 66 days to form a new habit, we're well and truly beyond that. So I think that is here to stay.
Do you agree with that, Bree?
With the changes, for sure. I mean, we are changing our habits. I was watching the movie Apollo 13 recently, you know, that Tom Hanks movie. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that, you know, these astronauts had a plan. They were going to the moon and something cataclysmic happened to them. And it's sort of analogous, I think, to what has happened to our society, our community. So we had plans of how 2020 was going to roll. Something's happened, and I think what has been so interesting is how adaptable people have been. And instead of us shooting for the stars, really it's come back to basics of how we're going to survive this. We've gone very much back to basics in our personal lives, but also in our business lives. So businesses have had to come back to the fundamentals. What are my inputs? What are my outputs? What are the needs in the marketplace? So I think this time has been an extraordinary one of almost bringing us back to what are the fundamentals of our life, what are the things we took for granted, and almost platforming what we want out of our lives. Now, it's existential for sure. But I think it's also, it could be a very exciting time as we re-emerge from the pandemic in the introspection that we've been able to do.
And Jenny, do you agree with all this too, or?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with the digital trends that Helen's talking about, the adaptability that Bree's talking about. We're seeing all of that in our research as well. I'd like to throw another theme in there, which is showing up for us, and something that's, I wouldn't say surprised me, but it's piqued my interest, which is about resiliency of the average Australian, person, and how we'll weather the economic storm that is something we're obviously facing into as well. And if you look at our data from the very beginning of COVID, essentially very early April is when we started tracking consumer sentiment. A very interesting thing for us is that sentiment in Australia is lower than the US, than China, a lot of other countries in the world that actually from a health crisis have been far worse off than Australia. And so really digging into that and trying to understand, is it because this has been a pretty protected economy for a long time, and that nervousness and that cautiousness that you see showing up in consumers and Australians is something where they're just looking at the uncertainty of what is facing them economically and saying, I'm not sure, and I'm nervous about this. It's certainly something we need to be watching over the next 6 months and 12 months, and businesses need to be responding to that.
Bree, how do we determine what's a moment in time and what's a permanent change? Because I think Jenny's raised some great points about the level of disruption that's here. How do we determine the difference between those two factors?
Well, if only we did have a crystal ball and we could tell what was going to be permanent. Will fidget spinners survive us all? I don't know. But ultimately, I think when we come to discern what is temporary versus permanent, look for where reward exceeds effort. So when the benefits of behaving in a particular way, either in business or in your personal life, if the reward for doing that is greater than the effort, then that's more likely to lay down the neuro pathways, and we're more likely to continue that behaviour. So things, for instance, like social distancing might be more temporary, and we've got to be hyper vigilant on that sort of behaviour because it's more effort and the reward, and we can get a little bit complacent around those sorts of behaviours. So I think reward greater than effort is essential for defining what's permanent. I think it's also, context becomes very important when it comes to establishing new behaviours, and the more stable an environment, the more stable a context, the more likely you are to establish those patterns. Now, as Helen said, we've had such a slice of time that it has been, although the pandemic's been happening, it's been relatively stable in our own behaviours. And so I think we will see, for instance, working from home become more likely to continue once the pandemic is over.
Helen, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I use a framework, to be honest, very similar to Bree around trigger, friction, and reward. So if you think about, I suppose quite relevant to me right now, I'm trying to get back into my fitness, going to the gym versus an online fitness class. The trigger might still be the same. That's my 7 o'clock workout time. The friction, it's much easier for me to roll out my mat just here rather than pack my bag and get back to that gym. But the reward part is really interesting, where you get so much benefit perhaps from the buzz of a busy gym, and you have to think about that. Is that benefit greater than the friction of me heading there? And what I find fascinating is how marketers have been adapting to this. They understand these three levers. So if you think about an online fitness brand like Sweat, they've been really actively building their communities, getting people to come together in online forums so that it does feel like the energy of the gym. So you can use those to sort of think about any behavior and how to make that behavior more sticky if it's working for your business right now.
And Jenny, how do you see that playing out in terms of how we determine what's permanent and what's a moment in time?
I like this theme that that Helen and Bree are talking about, which is some sort of equilibrium, right? And trying to understand what that new equilibrium is going to be in this next normal. And if I put it in the context of businesses and what they're facing, Bree, I think you touched on this. They're absolutely looking at working norms, and they're being sort of, everyone was thrust into the fact that you had to work from home. And so there was a little bit of momentum because that was a mandate, and there was no option. Everyone just kind of made that work, and adrenaline was going. So the first few months of COVID, you saw businesses moving into this state of, let's just make it work. Okay, it's actually, we can stay productive. This is really good. And now's the hard work, right? Now all the hard work kicks in to say, what's the sustainable model where we actually learned from the goodness of working from home and some of the new norms we were able to establish. That wasn't as bad as we thought it would be. Wow, my employees are still productive when I can't see them, and that's a good thing because then it gives them more flexibility. But we can't just have the pendulum swing the other way, right? The new normal will be some sort of equilibrium that's integrated between the way we were working before and this new way of working. And figuring that out is really hard. It's hard work. But a lot of the CEOs that we're talking to are saying that's the #1 challenge. Believe it or not, it's always performance, right? We're always helping them on the performance of their business. And this one is very much people and health related. And they said the #1 question, I was just on a forum last week, the #1 question they get in every town hall is, what's going to be our go forward work from home policy? Does anyone know yet? Has that been established? And that's really where people's minds are going. And so getting answers to them, getting your employee base comfortable with what the next normal is going to be is really important for productivity.
And Jenny, having the business expertise that you have, what's the prognosis for Australia? What length of time are we going to stay here? And are there any curveballs to watch out for?
I'll announce that I don't have my crystal ball either. I've left it somewhere. But we are spending a lot of time doing economic modeling about what the economy is going to do, which obviously is the most macro picture from a GDP perspective, and then how that trickles down to sectors, to businesses, and then to individuals. And the two axes that we're using to do that are, how effective are we going to be on handling the health crisis over the long term? And then the second axis is, how effective are we going to be at economic interventions? And the intersection of those two things give us multiple scenarios to look at. And one thing to note in the modeling, the difference of an 8-week lockdown equals 2 years of additional recessionary period. It's significant on the economy, that intersection. And I think that's something that doesn't probably get talked about enough, is what is the actual analytical answer between lockdown that like we see happening in Victoria, and how much we'll pay for that as individual consumers and individuals for years and years. So we are saying we're probably mid on both of those two axes at this point, but again, no crystal ball. So I do think we would say we're looking at multiple years of building back GDP to pre-COVID levels at this point.
I think that was a great analysis. Helen, how's your crystal ball looking?
Oh gosh, if the consultancy firm doesn't want to put something out there, I'm certainly not going to make grand statements. I think for me, it's really important to remember that this is impacting different people in so many different ways. Some businesses are absolutely flying right now, and others are struggling to keep their heads above water. Some people are financially better off than they've ever been. They're not commuting, they're not going out as much. And some people, of course, are facing real and significant financial hardship. And then we've got the difference between states and gender and age groups. One of the things that really jumped out at me actually was from our microshifts research in partnership with Kantar. And it said that far more women than men are feeling financially insecure about their future. And yet far more men than women are seeking financial advice and guidance right now. So the recovery journey for every individual, every business is going to be very different. And I think it's incumbent upon marketers to move beyond some of those all Australians sweeping statements that we like and be really sensitive to a multitude of different circumstances that there are right now.
You mentioned that some industries were doing well and some businesses were doing well. Can you give us an insight into what you're seeing in that area?
Yeah, well, when I spoke about the mass uptake of digital technologies, it's no surprise that e-commerce businesses are flying right now. But even within that, there are so many differences. The businesses that have had stock challenges or haven't been able to keep up with demand. There are, anecdotally, I heard something fascinating that people are buying more tops right now. So anyone who's making bottoms, if they're not tracksuits or they're not, gym gear, they're having a tough time. So there are, of course, the digital businesses, those that are doing well, but it's a very mixed bag amongst every industry. You really do have to get granular to start to think about that recovery.
Fantastic. And Bree, what's your prognosis for Australia?
Well, I think history will sort of record this moment in time, and there will be a before and an after. Unfortunately, we're in the middle at the moment, so it's sort of hard to tell when that will be. But unlike an event, I suppose, I can only liken it to something as large scale as 9/11. But it differs in that 9/11 was an event. There was a clear before and after. With this pandemic, it will be difficult to know when it's over. It's going to be resolved by degrees rather than decrees. So it won't be putting our flag down and saying crisis is now over. As we've seen recently in New Zealand, you've gone 100 days without any outbreaks and it's popped up again. So the result of this is that I think people will be easily spooked by the market conditions, or the market will be easily spooked as well. So there'll be a strange swirl of people getting easily worried whenever they hear of something, or are we going back? Are we going back into lockdown, for instance? But in those intervening times, there'll be an interesting normalisation of living in this uncertainty. So the danger again with the normalisation of this sort of behaviour is that we become complacent around it, which then heightens the risk of reinfection. But so my prognosis, look, I think it's going to be very difficult in terms of people's mental health, financial health, the Australian economy, of course. And I think, we've got some hard yards ahead of us, although hopefully there are signs of the businesses that are growing being able to lift all boats.
Fingers crossed that, we start to see some uplift. You've all mentioned people and community as a factor in the prognosis for Australia moving forward. Helen, how have community values changed and what's the flow-on effect for businesses?
This has been one of the lovely, heartwarming things, surprising, that's popped up. We've just seen people come together in so many wonderful ways to support and help each other. And I think that heightened sense of community it will endure. I think of these initiatives like Buy Them a Coffee, popping up and giving a caffeine boost to those healthcare workers. Or we actually launched a stay home sticker on Instagram, and that was used more than 300 million times globally in the first few weeks. So people want to help out and they want to do the right things by each other, and people are actually actively supporting their local businesses. 37% of people say they've made a special effort to support a local or a small business in the last few weeks. And with their own actions, they're expecting the same from other businesses and brands. They don't just want those empty marketing gestures. So look, it's absolutely fine to say we're all in this together, as long as a business is actively doing something about that as well. And this is impacting purchase decisions. So nearly half of Australians say that, whether a business is looking after its employees with sick benefits, is it supporting its local community, is it using environmentally sustainable practices? These are key decision-making factors for them. So I think, look, a growing recognition that individual micro actions and business actions can aggregate to a greater effect. So I think we'll see more of this, and I certainly hope to.
Jenny, how do you see it playing out from a business perspective, given that there's a rising community spirit during COVID-19?
We have seen something similar as Helen's describing around in our research with consumers around across different segments. So as Helen was mentioning, there are different segments of consumers experiencing this very differently. There are some who have lost a job or lost income, and others who are still stable. But across them, it's pretty uniform that supporting local businesses is something they say they want to do, which I think is a hook. So if you can actually communicate as a business that you are local, or you manufacture local, or what is it about you that you can allow a consumer to hook into, I think that's a really effective stickiness to create with consumers at a time like this. If you turn the camera inward to businesses and how they're thinking about community, I want to pick up on that mental health challenge that Bree mentioned, because again, what are CEOs talking about right now? I have heard a few tell me, I'm not equipped to deal with the number one challenge we're facing right now, which is the mental health of our employees. We weren't trained as CEOs for this to be such a big issue. And that's a real challenge. It's a real gap. And those workplace communities coming together and supporting each other and figuring out very nimbly, very quickly, ways to keep buoyancy amongst employees who are, in Victoria locked down and isolated, with childcare being pulled away in a lot of situations, real stressful times, be acting as leaders and business leaders to really alleviate some of that pain. And accommodate for it and not ding people in their reviews, right? All the things that are unintended consequences of these things not being handled appropriately and acknowledged is something that we're having lots of conversations about.
And Bree, as a behavioural expert, how are people feeling at this time, and what is the flow-on effect for businesses? How can they make better decisions around that?
Well, I think ultimately there's a great sense of uncertainty, and uncertainty means fear. Now, when people are jittery, that's going to play out in a number of different ways. Some people are in entire denial, and some people are, dropping their bundles and they really can't cope, which is then it's what is the responsibility of their employer and their community to support them in that. I think the call to action, if I had one for business, is really about how do you give confidence to these people that are jittery, either your staff or your consumers. So how do you signal confidence in you as a business? So how do they look to you as someone who is confident in your actions, but also how do you give them confidence in themselves? And I think that's going to be key in terms of helping everyone get through this.
Helen, what are some good examples of things businesses have done this year in connecting with consumers and encouraging purchasing behaviour while being sensitive at the same time?
There are so many. I love to see the agility of brands in the last few months. I think those that have seen, I suppose, opportunity, it sounds the wrong word to use, but seeing ways to help people. One that springs to mind actually around the community angle and small businesses was CUB. And they partnered and created a program to support your local pub. And they created a platform. People could buy a voucher for a beer for when pubs were reopened again, and CUB then matched that with a donation. It was over $1 million, I think. And it gave those small businesses a real lifeline with the cash flow challenges that they were facing. And I just think, gosh, that's smart. And then people creating these amazing experiences and online concerts. And I just, honestly, I could talk forever, so I'll probably pause there. But I just think the ingenuity has been amazing. It really has.
Jenny, what are some best practice examples in your opinion?
We've all talked about the big uncertainty, no crystal ball uncertainty, and businesses, as they stare into that, the big thing for them is they can't get paralyzed. And uncertainty can create this, I'm just going to freeze because I'm not sure what to do. And so unlocking that, one of the best practices that we're working with a lot of our clients on is scenario planning, and really creating their own two grid axis that basically says, how much disruption to our business model do we think we're going to face, and what's the level of uncertainty around that? And then how much disruption to demand are we going to face in our specific category, in our specific sector? And when you have those two things in play and you can start to put dimensions to what those scenarios might be, you can then actually look across all of them and say, what would I do no matter what? It doesn't matter what scenario plays out, I'm going to invest in digital, as Helen was talking about. We know that that's going to be part of a winning business in the future. And so therefore you push on that. In other cases, you say, well, I'd only make that investment or that change in the business if this one scenario plays out. So I've just got to monitor it and figure out what the trigger point is to kick that into action. But that scenario planning philosophy is a best practice. And the other one is the conditionality of how you think about budgeting. So we keep saying, the quarter is the new year. And that's really true. And sometimes it's actually the month or the week is the new year. So annual cycles of how we set budgets and how we think about allocating resources are just completely thrown out the window for leading businesses that are actually saying we need to be more nimble in the way we think about the moves we want to make and the resources that we can push towards that move because we've reserved some on a conditional basis.
I'd love to build on that, Jenny, because I think, the time of laying down your marketing activity for the year ahead is long gone. And the businesses that fared best during the initial COVID impact were those that quickly adapted, were agile. I think of the Warehouse Group in New Zealand, who just in 2 days turned around an entire digital mailer catalogue when New Zealand changed their level of restrictions. And I think we'll really see this shift from fixed to flexible marketing being far more agile than ever before, rapid test and learn. And, especially with all the changes recently, I think the ability to, for example, move quickly from an online to an offline objective or the other way, having that flexibility, those are the businesses that are really going to be able to grab hold of something and start to thrive.
Bree, what are some brands or practices that have really shone for you this year?
Well, I think back to my remark about Apollo 13, I think the healthy thing has been, just like the astronauts had to look around them and say, what do we have at our disposal to help us survive this? I think it's forced particularly small business owners, but business leaders as well, to really go back to basics and say, what do we really need to do? So the experiences, for instance, of the gin manufacturer who had been able to change and launch hand sanitizer. I mean, and the stage manufacturer who then developed office furniture. I mean, these people went back and said, fundamentally, what are our inputs and outputs as a business and how can we transition them? What I think is going to be interesting, and it's a quote that I read somewhere and I can't remember where but the saying is, there is no margin in needs. And I think this is really important because at the moment, a lot of the businesses have pivoted around need because wants have sort of washed away. So consumers are sort of back to basics as well. But as we move, as time goes on, we're going to be moving back into the wants category, because if everyone's manufacturing masks, it's just going to be a price war. So that's going to be a really interesting transition as we move from the phase we're in now, longer term.
Fantastic. And Bree, I might start with you to close out our last question and then move on from there with the other ladies. 1 year from now, what's going to be the same and what is going to have changed?
Oh, you love the crystal ball questions,
I love
don't you?
all about the crystal ball.
It's so difficult. We've just been talking about how impossible that is. But look, a year is not a long time. And I think what will be the same is that we'll tend to take things for granted. That's your human behaviour. We'll go back to taking teachers for granted and nurses for granted. And I think the danger is that we'll start to blame mistakes that were made during the pandemic from the position of hindsight. So that's the downside of, I suppose, what won't change about human behaviour. I think what will be different, again, it's not a positive view, but there'll be a lot of debt that we have to cope with as a community. And I think the concept of what is an asset in a business will change. And this might be my latent accounting qualifications popping up, but instead of it being the tangible, the expression of our address or the products that we make, I think the concept will very much be, who are the people in my business and how can I get the most from them? Because that's really where the ingenuity is coming from.
And Helen?
I wonder if the view from my desk is going to be the same in a year's time, or at least more often this will be the view for me. And gosh, by then I think businesses will have really got to grips with operating in a more contactless world. Everyone's finding their feet right now, but I think more people will be communicating with businesses via messaging. I think we will have seen the rise of social commerce. We only need to look to China to see the phenomenal potential growth there for us. And with all of this, it's going to cause a shake-up of the businesses that we see around us. It's the digital education, the new technologies, they've opened up that playing field. They've leveled the playing field, I guess. So, businesses that make themselves really useful, that create seamless real and virtual experiences, brands that act upon their values, those are the ones that are going to do well. And look, without naming names, I think some of the big brands, the big businesses that we see around us, they may not do so well by then.
Jenny, what's one thing that's going to stay the same and what's one thing that's going to be different?
I couldn't agree more with Helen that COVID is this great sorting mechanism in the business community, and we will see emerge. Some will be leaders today, but and will have been used to them as being leaders, but they will emerge as the leaders of the future on a few dimensions. It'll be digital, making investments in data and technology, because I don't just mean commerce. That we'll see a lot more just digital infrastructure in businesses, and the ones that survive. We'll see a lot more boldness, willingness to say, let's try that new technology to interface with consumers around virtual. It's something new, it's something different. So we'll see lots of boldness. And that third one is around agility. We'll see businesses that have infrastructure that allow them to say, I'm not a marketing person. I'm someone who's here to solve problems for a business, and I'm part of a cross-functional squad, and this is how we operate. And that energy and that speed to make decisions and move is something that I think will be more table stakes than it was before.
Thank you so much, guys, for sharing your insights today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Please take a moment to fill out the survey on our AdNews page and stay tuned for our deep dives that are coming up as part of Future Now as we look at retail, technology, travel, and more. See you soon.